get the music down. Hello, everyone. It is Kristi. It is Saturday, and it's time to get back to some data feminism. Yeah, welcome back to How the Patriarchy Ruins Everything. And as usual, we're going to be doing, hopefully this is, like zooming in on my face. Hopefully the flicker, I did some anti-flicker techniques in order to try to improve that situation. We'll find out today whether or not it worked. I noticed that I tend to flicker more when I'm running things like Spotify, and there's some competing things on the screen. So I don't know. Anyway, let's get to it. Last time we got, I think, about halfway through the first chapter, and it's discussing the ways in which I think I'm a little soft. So I'm going to turn my mic up. I've got a new setup. I'm still always playing around with my setup. So let me just check this. It's on 2. I'll put it up on 3 and then see if it's, yeah, that seems okay. Well, I think I saw a flicker. Anyway, we're going to keep going on this. And yeah, we were discussing what bodies count and which bodies are counted. And so we're going to continue on with this analysis of the way that we construct reality through the concepts by which we filter the world and organize it, and how a lot of times unconscious or very conscious biases are included in these concepts that seem to structure society rather than reflect accurately like the variety in society. So yeah, we're going to start with this bodies extracted for science, surveillance, and selling. I will also, let me see, there's a footnote here that we just finished on, so let's go ahead and, oh, it's very long. It's a very long footnote. We're going to skip footnotes. It's a PDF. It's available for free if you want it. So, yeah, let me just make sure the desktop audio is unmuted. It is, so I think we are ready to go. Do a little test just to make sure. Oh, also, let's change the voice up. What about Tasha? We'll go for Tasha, see how Tasha sounds today. All right, let's go.
Bodies extracted for science, surveillance, and selling. Far too often, the problem is not that bodies go uncounted or undercounted, or that their existence or their interests go unacknowledged, but the reverse, that their information is enthusiastically scooped up for the narrow purposes of our
pause,
data collecting institutions. For example, in 2012, the New York Times published an explosive article by Charles Duhigg, How Companies Learn Your Secrets, which soon became the stuff of legend in data and privacy circles. Duhigg describes how Andrew Pohl, a data scientist working at Target, synthesized customers' purchasing histories with the timeline of those purchases in order to infer if a customer might be pregnant. Evidently, pregnancy is the second major life event, after leaving for college, that determines whether a casual shopper will become a customer for life. Pohl's algorithm was so accurate that he could not only identify the pregnant customers, but also predict their due dates. But then Target turned around and put this algorithm into action by sending discount coupons to pregnant customers. Win-win. Or so they thought, until a Minneapolis teenager's dad saw the coupons for maternity clothes that she was getting in the mail and marched into his local Target to read the manager the riot act. Why was his daughter getting coupons for pregnant women when she was only a teen? It turned out that the young woman was, indeed, pregnant. Pohl's algorithm informed Target before the teenager informed her father. Evidently, there are approximately 25 common products, including unscented lotion and large bags of cotton balls, that, when analyzed together, can predict whether or not a customer is pregnant, and if so, when they are due to give birth. In the case of the Minneapolis teen, the win-win quickly became a lose-lose, as Target lost a potential customer and the pregnant teenager lost far worse, her privacy over information related to her own body and her health. In this way, Target's pregnancy prediction algorithm helps to illustrate another reason why bodies must be brought back to the data science table. Without the ability of individuals and communities to shape the terms of their own data collection, their bodies can be mined and their data can be extracted far too easily, and done so by powerful institutions who rarely have their best interests at heart.
I'm going to pause this here because I want to comment on the fact that I still seem a little bit soft relative to the audio on the screen. So I'm going to turn that up a little bit. This book is, I think, primarily aimed at people who are interested in data and data collection, but have not had any training in intersectionality or feminist critique or critical race theory. as an analysis in terms of how structural racism is built into our institutions. And I think this example of Target is a really, really good one because this dude, looks like they were using he, him pronouns, right? Charles, learn your signature, Andrew Pohl, right? Yeah, it's great to monetize pregnancies in terms of if you're a Target and you provide pregnancy-related products to your customers. But the question of privacy of that very intimate thing was not apparently considered at all in their chasing for dollars. And the situation that Target put this teen girl in, incredibly uncomfortable. I don't think it would necessarily violate HIPAA or medical data protection because they weren't releasing her medical data, but they were making inferences based on her shopping and then assuming that kind of stuff and treating her as if. So I'm not entirely sure whether or not there's any kind of legal recourse for this, but it comes down to, I think, that question in Jurassic Park. Your scientists were so busy wondering whether or not they could, they never stopped to think if they should. And the age of the person that they're targeting was not a consideration. Yeah. And as a consequence, it put this young girl, or this teen girl, I should say, I don't know how young she was, but this put this pregnant teenager in a terrible position and violated her privacy. It might not have been a legal violation of her privacy, but ethically, morally, it was a violation of her privacy.
At root, this is another question of power, along with a question of priorities and resources, financial ones. Data collection and analysis can be prohibitively expensive. At Facebook's newest data center in New Mexico, the electrical cost alone is estimated at $31 million annually. Only corporations like Target, along with well-resourced governments and elite research universities, have the resources to collect, store, maintain, and analyze data at the highest levels. It's the flip side of the lack of data on maternal health outcomes. Put crudely, there is no profit to be made collecting data on the women who are dying, but there is significant profit in knowing whether women are pregnant. Data has been called the new oil for, among other things, its untapped potential for profit and its value once it's processed and refined. But just as the original oil barons were able to use that profit to wield outsized power in the world, think of John D. Rockefeller, J. Paul Getty, or, more recently, the Koch brothers, so too do the Targets of the world use their data capital to consolidate control over their customer. But it's not petroleum that's extracted in this case. It's data that's extracted from people and communities with minimal consent. Bodies.
This
basic fact creates a profound asymmetry between who is collecting, storing, analyzing, and visualizing data, and whose information is collected, stored, analyzed, and visualized. The values that drive this extraction of data represent the interests and priorities of the universities, governments, and corporations that are dominated by elite, white men.
This is true. This also has a reflection in what gets funded, because white men okay, we're just trying to talk about the West. White men historically excluded everybody else from power. White women and all people of color, men, women, non-binary, right? We were excluded as a group. And so the agendas, the norms, all of that was set by a very unrepresentative group of people. Now, of course, there are some things that, regardless of your gender or where you sit intersectionally in a society, there are some research questions you might be interested in. But there is definitely if there's not a good representation, then nobody is in the room to make the case for why this piece of research should be done. Let me give you an example, right? This granted took place in the 1970s. There was a student who was thinking about doing her PhD, and she went to her supervisor and said she wanted to do a PhD because she couldn't find anything on it on the sociology of housework. And he looked at her very confused and said, that's not an object, of inquiry for sociology. Sociology doesn't look at housework. Well, why not, considering how much labor it eats up in people's lives, especially and disproportionately in women's lives? And so, if you don't think something counts as worthy of study because it doesn't affect you personally, that doesn't mean that it's not worthy of study. It just means you need to get out of the way and let other people who have these concerns fund their research, follow the data, and do those things, and to not block and not veto and not stand in the way.
We name these values the 3 S's: science, universities; surveillance, governments; and selling, corporations. In the case of Target and the pregnant teen, the originating charge from the marketing department to Andrew Pohl was, if we wanted to figure out if a customer is pregnant, even if she didn't want us to know, can you do that? But did the teenager have access to her purchasing data? Did she or her parents have a
No.
hand in formulating any of the questions that Target might wish to ask of its millions of records of consumer purchases? Did
I don't know why they're skipping the no in that, but there's the answers to both of those questions is no.
they even know that their family's purchasing data was being analyzed and recorded? No, no, no. They were not invited to the design table, even though it was one on which their personal data was put out on corporate display. Instead, it was Target, company currently valued at $32 billion, that determined what data to collect and what questions to ask of it. The harms inflicted by this asymmetry don't only have to do with personal exposure and embarrassment, but also with the systematic monitoring, control, and punishment of the people and groups who hold less power in society. For example, Paola Villarreal's data analysis for the ACLU reveals clear racial disparities in the city of Boston's approach to policing marijuana-related offenses.
We know that's true.
Additional analyses have found this phenomenon to be true in cities across the United States. In Automating Inequality, Virginia Eubanks provides another example of how the asymmetrical relationship between data collecting institutions and the people about which they collect data plays out. The Allegheny County Office of Children, Youth, and Families in Pennsylvania employs an algorithmic model to predict the risk of child abuse. Additional methods of detecting child abuse would seem to be a good thing. But the problem with this particular model, as with most predictive algorithms in use in the world today, is that it has been.
Pause while I scroll down past this massive footnote. Oh no. Designed poorly. Come on, give me back. What? Why aren't you letting me interact with you? Do. I can't interact with anything down here. What's going on?
And in Advancing the 26, Chapter 1, Bring Back the Bodies, designed unreflexively. In this case, the problem is rooted in the fact that it takes into account every single data source that it can get. For wealthier parents, who can more easily access private healthcare and mental health services, there is simply not that much data. But for poor parents, who primarily access public resources, the model scoops up records from child welfare services, drug and alcohol treatment programs, mental health services, jail records, Medicaid histories, and so on. Because there is far more data about poor parents, they are oversampled in the model and disproportionately targeted for intervention. The model confuse parenting while poor with poor parenting, Eubanks explains, with the most profound of results. Ensuring that bodies are not simply viewed as a resource, like oil, that can be extracted and refined, is another way that data feminism can intervene in our current data practices. Like the process of data collection, this process of extracting bodies is one that disproportionately impacts women, people of color, and others who are more often subject to power rather than in possession of it. And it's another place where bringing the bodies back into discussions about data collection and its consequences can begin to challenge and transform the unequal systems that we presently face. Bodies absent from data work. One place where these conversations need to be happening is in the field of data science itself. It's no surprise to observe that women and people of color are underrepresented in data science, just as they are in STEM fields as a whole. The surprising thing is that the problem is getting worse. According to a research report published by the American Association of University Women in 2015, women comprised 35% of computing and mathematical occupations in 1990. But this percentage dropped to 2006% in 2013.4. They are being pushed out as data analysts have become rebranded as data scientists, in order to make room for more highly valued and more highly compensated men. We identify this later in the book as what we call a privilege hazard, one in which discrimination.
Pause. For some reason, it's not like picking up math stuff. It's really acting up. It's I'm not entirely sure why. I'm a little bit afraid to refresh it. So what I might have to do is just skip ahead, for which I apologize, because it's not nice to listen to. But
4-4 comparison. And for example, by this phenomenon, scholar, historian, the bodies absent from data work 27 becomes hard-coded into so-called intelligent systems because the people doing the coding are the most privileged and therefore least well-equipped to acknowledge and account for inequity. This privilege hazard is a risk that can rear its head in harmful ways. For example, in 2016, MIT Media Lab graduate student Joy Buolamwini, founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, was experimenting with software libraries for the Aspire Mirror project. This project used computer vision software to overlay inspirational images, like a favorite animal or an admired celebrity, onto a reflection of the user's face. She would open up her computer and run some code that she'd written, built on a free JavaScript library that used her computer's built-in camera to detect the contours of her face. Buolamwini's code was bug-free, but she couldn't get the software to work for a more basic reason. It had a really hard time detecting her face in front of the camera. Buolamwini has dark skin. While her computer's camera picked up her lighter-skinned colleague's face immediately, it took much longer for the camera to pick up Buolamwini's face, when it did at all. Even then, sometimes, her nose was identified as her mouth. What was going on? What was going on was this. Facial analysis technology, which uses machine learning approaches, learns how to detect faces based on existing collections of data that are used to train, validate, and test the algorithms for use in future models. These datasets are constructed in advance in order to present any particular learning algorithm with a representative sample of the kinds of things it might encounter in the real world. But problems arise very quickly when the biases that already exist in the world are replicated in these datasets. Upon digging into the benchmarking data for facial analysis algorithms, Buolamwini learned that they consisted of 78% male faces and 84% pale faces.
Okay, so this is what we mean when we say science is racist. Again, the point of science is that it should be an understanding of how the world works, and it should be inclusive of all and representative of all the data available. However, if you are only if you're doing 75% male faces and only 25% women's faces or female presenting faces, or even we don't even have classification for non-binary here, you're going to skew your model because your data is incorrect. You should be doing it in proportion with the population, because that's the population it's going to have to work for, right? And so it should only be about 49% male faces. If you want to be like distribution in terms of a false gender binary, just breaking things into male female, you should be at least not having more than 49% male faces, because men aren't the majority in the world. Like, I think just generally there's a slightly higher, within a margin of error too. It's not like a big one, but I think that there tends to be more birth to females in a cis sense. Because we are just going to talk about biology for the moment. Like a cis female form is slightly more, like 51%, I think I remember seeing. And so, yeah, bad models, you can't get good outcomes with bad data. Your models can be great, your code can be perfect, but if what you're putting in is garbage relative to, like, not saying male faces are garbage or that pale faces are garbage, but if you're trying to get 1/4 of the population to represent the 100% of the population, yeah, it's going to fall down. And this goes to making people feeling alienated from these fields and like they don't belong. And there's a reason why. It's because when they go to use the software, it doesn't work for them because it wasn't built for them, because the people who look like them aren't being included in the development, or aren't at the table, or not being thought about for racist reasons.
Sharply at odds with a global population that is majority female and non-pale. How could such an oversight have happened? Easily, when most engineering teams have 1, few women or people of color, and 2, no training to think about number 1 as a problem. Oversights like this happen more often than you might think, and with a wide.
Yeah, we're going to have to do that thing where I skip ahead again because for some reason Speechify is being weird. So
6. This is the book 7 specific and Bulam, but chat bring back the bodies figure.
There we go. Oh, okay. Sometimes Speechify gets a little bit haunted. All right, so this was the woman who literally had to resort to white facing in order to get her computer to detect her face, because they didn't train the AI on non-white faces, which is messed up. Okay.
Algorithm to detect her face. Many facial detection algorithms have only been trained on pale and male faces.
All right, we're gonna skip
Credit
that.
Joy Bulamwini source. Permission. Range of consequences.
There we go.
Consider a craze that briefly swept the internet in spring 2018. In order to promote awareness of its growing number of digitized museum collections, Google released a new feature for its arts and culture app. You could take a selfie, upload the image, and the app would find the face from among its millions of digitized artworks that looked the most like you. All Twitter and Instagram, people were posting side-by-side shots of themselves and, for instance, the Mona Lisa, American Gothic, or a Vermeer. White people were, because most of the museums with collections that Google had helped to digitize came from the US, and Europe most featured artworks from the Western canon. And because most artworks from the Western canon feature white people, the white users of the Arts and Culture app found really good matches for their faces. But some Asian users of the app, for example, found themselves matched with one of only the handful of portraits of Asian people included in those collections.
So this is something that I'm starting to get more comfortable with as I get older, which is being comfortable in not knowing. So, when people put this thing together, it would seem to me it would have been a good idea to forethink these ideas a little bit, right? Is to think, okay, well, who did the painting, right? Again, white males held exclusively these privileges, powers, the autonomy to get the training, to be apprenticed, to gain the skills, to be able to travel, to earn the money, to negotiate the contracts, all of that economic, legal, social stuff, religious acknowledgement, right? Because we know that Western religions are all sexist AF. That this is it's a mirror, right? People want to basically, like see themselves, like, right? I think the reason a lot of younger white men are mad about the woke culture is because they grew up as children and teens and older adults. If you're a white man, you have a lot of role models. And if you have to suddenly start identifying with a role model who doesn't look like you, you're not used to that because the entire world is catered to helping you put yourself in the place of a hero, to identify with the hero, to vicariously experience the victories of the hero. But you're never challenged on your gender identity or your body shape or, like your skin color, because everything is built around what you already know. And this is this default assumption that my white world is enough to cover everybody is what needs to get challenged. And it's just taking a moment to pause and think, dang, like, could this go wrong? How could this go wrong? Who isn't represented in these paintings? I'm going to put an analogy. In the last year and a half, I have chilled out a lot about not knowing people's pronouns and just asking. I've also chilled out a lot about acknowledging that if I am learning someone's pronouns, especially if I'm relearning their pronouns, that I'm going to mess up. And as long as they know that I'm not trying to misgender them, I'm just trying to break a habit. It's not the worst thing in the world to mess up, apologize, and correct yourself. So just being vague about someone's, like being undetermined about someone's pronouns until they clarify them to you is also like, who are we not taking into account when we're creating these programs, and who's going to feel excluded? Also, again, you just think there's like a group of white people doing this, because I would imagine, especially in the Western canon, most of the artwork is going to show Black people as low-level laborers or slaves or somehow the property of white people. And what emotional consequence does that provide someone when they go and they want to engage in this app and their best friend who's white is like, oh, look, I look like the Mona Lisa. And it's like, oh, I look like the trumpeter that belonged to Henry VIII. It's kind of a difference in like the vibes there, right? And it's just about being a little bit cautious, thinking outside of your racial bubble, and thinking who isn't represented, not just who is.
On Twitter, the response to this inadequacy was tellingly resigned. One user, Pichaya, whose tweet was quoted in a Dig.com article on the subject, tweeted sarcastically, "If you do that whole Google Arts and Culture app portrait comparison as an Asian male, it gives you one of 5-6 portraits that hardly resembles you, but, hey, looks Asian enough." Another user, Argian, also quoted in the piece, called out Google directly. "The Google Arts and Culture app thinks I look like a beautiful Japanese woman. G, get more Asian faces in your art. Bodies in database, Google." And if the disparities of representation in Western art museums weren't enough of a problem, some art and culture app users worried about something more insidious taking place. For app users to upload their images for analysis, they had to agree to allow Google to access those images. Were their images also being stored for future internal research? Was Google secretly using crowdsourcing to improve its training data for its own facial recognition software, or for the NSA? A short-lived internet uproar ensued, ending only when Google updated the user agreement to say, "Google won't use data from your photo for any other purpose and will only store your photo for the time it takes to search for matches."
I'm just gonna pause. Hey, Big Zebra, sorry that you got an ad for Tinder. I do, when I set it, I set the ads to not force you to watch non-skippable ads. I do allow skippable ads though, because I don't shill my Patreon and I don't shill my channel. However, I still like have to pay for electricity and stuff and new equipment. So letting people skip ads and built-in ads, I figure are a slight inconvenience, but I'm not always trying to push my Patreon on you, and I'm not always trying to push you to, like, I'm not like downing on people who do that. But I figured that was like the least intrusive way to get a little bit of money for the content I'm providing. So yeah, sorry that you got your Tinder ad, but I do have to pay the bills, and that's my very low level way of doing it. So okay, continuing.
What if they had been? The art selfie conspiracy theorists weren't actually too far from reality, given that earlier that year, Amazon had briefly contracted with the Orlando Police Department to use its own proprietary facial recognition software, trained on its own proprietary data, to help the police automatically identify suspects in real time. How representative was Amazon's training, benchmarking, or validation data? Was it more or less representative than the data that Blolomlini explored in her research? There was no way to know. And while a best match of 44% between Asian art and culture app users and Terashima Shimai's Beautiful Woman, which is the painting Arjuon matched with, might earn RTS of solidarity on
Retweets of
Twitter, a
solidarity.
best match of 44% between a suspected criminal and a random person identified through traffic camera footage, the image source for the Amazon project could send an innocent person to jail. Who any particular system is designed for, and who that system is designed by, are both issues that matter deeply.
I want to pause that. Who any particular system is designed for, and who that system is designed by, are both both issues that matter deeply. And that, I think it's kind of sad that that's kind of buried in the paragraph, because ultimately that's what this is all about. Like, what are the systems designed for, and who is designing them? And these things will lead you on to questions about who gets represented, who gets targeted, who gets seen, who is included, who is operationalized as a human being. And then the implications are built in. Like, you're already building in some of your outcomes based on the kinds of categories you allow to be in your inputs.
Matter because the biases they encode, and often unintentionally amplify, remain unseen and unaddressed, that is, until someone like Bulamini literally has to face them. What's more, without women and people of color more involved in the coding and design process, the new research questions that might yield groundbreaking results don't even get asked, because they're not around to ask them. As the example of facial analysis technology, or the Google Arts and Culture app help to show, there is a much higher likelihood that biases will be designed into data systems if the bodies of the system's designers themselves only represent the dominant group.
Just we're going to go on to the next one here quickly, but I was asked by my had a department to record some social media videos for participants at a conference at GASIS right before the Christmas holidays. Like the 10th, 6th or 10th of December or something like that. I don't remember what it was. Anyway, and when I went and gave my pitch, the room itself was quite diverse. It was very much 50-50 in terms of, like, again, going to false gender binary, but because I can't necessarily identify someone as non-binary, but it was not skewed in one direction or the other. It was pretty well distributed in terms of gender, like, presentations, and there was a pretty good mix of people of color and white people. So when I was giving my pitch, one of the things I said was, not to, like, just for the white guys in here, like, we know that you're very self-confident and you're the most likely to volunteer yourself for these kinds of things. But I really want to encourage women and people of color and women of color, men of color and women of color, non-binary people of color, to please think about doing one of these, to come and see me, because I want the diversity that's in this room to be represented in the videos that we make. And I mean, I don't know if I had any, how much those words really impacted, but almost half of the participants who did the video segment were women, and about half of them were people of color. And that made me feel really good. Like, I hopefully, if nothing else, they were quite brave and they felt welcomed or whatever else. But it was important to me to not filter out, because the keynote speakers were both white men. And if those were the only two people I talked to because they were the experts, it really would not have reflected what was actually happening in that room. And it would not acknowledge the work and the interest of people of color and of white women to that conference. And so it's not that I wanted to make white men feel excluded. I wanted people who would normally say, oh, no, that's not for me, to feel welcome enough to say, okay, maybe I'll take a shot. And the people who do that usually have a little less confidence. So, I think being aware of it is the way you counter it. And you can't fix problems that you don't know about.
Bodies invisible. The view from nowhere is always a view from somewhere. So far, we've shown how bringing the bodies back into data science can help expose the inequities in the scope and contents of our dataset. As in the example of the hundreds of unnamed U.S. women who die in childbirth each year, we've also shown how bringing back the bodies can help avoid their data being mined without their consent, as in the example of the Minneapolis teenager who Target identified as pregnant. And we've also shown how bringing bodies that are more representative of the population into the field of data science can help avert the 30 Chapter 1. Bring back the bodies.
Yep.
Increasing number of racist, sexist data products that are inadvertently released into the world, as in the example of the Google Arts and Culture app.
Here's another point I wanted to make. I guess it's not so much a book club as it is like me having a book read out and then commenting on it, but unintentional racism is still harmful. Just because you are blinded by your white bubble or your male privilege, and you did engage in research and putting out a product that inadvertently excludes most of the population except for people who look like you, doesn't mean that you're like a horrible evil person. What it does mean, though, is that you are suboptimally designing your products. You don't even have to like really take this on a personal level as I'm a horrible racist, but I think and the sciences, we are supposed to aim for models that represent the world. And in order for our models to accurately assess and help us understand or help us predict outcomes, they have to include all the important variables. And one person can't always see all the important variables. So when someone says your product is racist, it could be very true. That doesn't mean you were intentionally racist. What it means is that your privilege, your bubble, your lack of thinking outside of what's your comfort zone has produced racist results, because it has not included, or sexist results, because it has excluded people based, on your own little bubble. And I think that not always jumping to a defensive position of saying, well, I'm not a racist. How could I design a racist system? look, we all have a lot of unconscious biases that we are conditioned with based on the culture that we have to unlearn. And the easiest way to go, wow, you're right. I really just was in my own little world here, and I needed to consult with other people, and I needed a diverse user base to engage with my product before I put it out.
Or of the facial recognition software that is the focus of Joy Boulamwin's research. We'll have more to say about some of its worst applications, like state surveillance, in the chapters to come. But there are other bodies that need to be brought back into the field of data science, not because they're not yet represented, but because of the exact opposite reason. They are overrepresented in the field. They are so overrepresented that their identities and their actions are simply assumed to be the default.
Exactly.
An example that Yanni Lukisas includes in his book, All Data Are Local, makes this point crystal clear.
For instance, I think about car mechanic places I used to hear. You'd walk in and there'd be pictures of pinup girls with boobs all over. And you'd point this out and the men would get defensive, saying, this is my workspace, I can have it however I want. I'm like, yeah, but you're making it hostile to anyone who isn't you, doesn't find what you find sexually appealing. When people like Thunderfoot got upset because women would come into very sexist, boys only, or boys club, old boys club, is that what I'm thinking, the phrase that I'm looking for? It's escaping me at the moment. Cultures, because it was basically an extension of the locker room. The problem isn't the women. The problem is science should be accessible to everyone. Those spaces should be welcome to everyone. And you've had this exclusively to yourself because in the past people were discriminated on. So the problem isn't that women or gay people need to conform themselves to your heterosexual, cis-normative, misogynistic worldview. What needs to happen is that needs to be broken down because it's a barrier to entry. And you need to make your environment one where people are welcomed and respected and valued because they are providing perhaps the kind of expertise that you will never have as a white man, because you will never live those experiences and your model is going to suffer for it. So it's not just about like the data collection and the individuals. It is also about the culture and really forcing people who have been living inside of a little safe space bubble where their dominance and their preferences and their norms have never been challenged, to realize that those things are now obstacles to getting talented people in the door.
Maria McWhorter, a historian at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture, recalls searching the Smithsonian's internal catalog for the terms black and white. Searching the millions of catalog entries for black yielded a rich array of objects related to black people, black culture, and black history in the U.S. The civil rights movement, the jazz era, the history of enslavement, and so on. But searching for white yielded only white-colored visual art. Almost nothing showed up relating to the history of white people in the United States. McWhorter, who is black, knew the reason why. In the United States, it's white people and their bodies who occupy the default position.
This is what I call the white bubble. You grow up seeing white bodies, the white aesthetics, white men as heroes, white women as damsels in distress, white people's concerns, suburban life, all this sort of like sitcom kind of thing that takes place in this sort of idealized white bubble. And as a consequence, you get conditioned to not think about everyone else. You're the default. I'm not racist. That's just the way it is.
Their existence seems so normal that they go unremarked upon. They need not be categorized because it is, again, assumed. Most people are like them. This is how the perspective of only one group of bodies, the most dominant and powerful group, becomes invisibly embedded in a larger system, whether it's a system of classification, as in the case of McWhorter's catalog search, a system of surveillance, as in the case of Amazon and the Orlando police, or a system of knowledge, as reflected in a data visualization, as we'll now explain. Whose perspective are we seeing when we see a visualization like this one of global shipping routes? We are not seeing any particular person's perspective when we look at this map, unless you are an astronaut on the space station and you have weird blue glasses on that make all the continents blue.
Let me see if I can find this. Here's the picture they're referring to. Right. And there's just FYI, keep that in mind as this text is being read out, because we're not seeing it yet because it's on the next page.
In terms of visualization design, this is for good reason. It is precisely this impossible, totalizing view which makes any particular visualization so dazzling and seductive, so rhetorically powerful, and so persuasive. This image appears to show us the big picture of the entire world. Because we do not see the designers of this image, nor can we detect any visual indicators of human involvement. The image appears truthful, accurate, and free of bias. This is what feminist philosopher Donna Haraway describes as the God trick. By the God part, Haraway refers to how data is often presented as though
I'm going to let the footnote be read this time because it's kind of short, and also it does lead on to this. So I'm rare case, I'm gonna have the footnote read out.
sociologist Helen Kennedy and her colleagues have shown how visual conventions, such as two-dimensional layouts and geometric shapes, contribute to the pervasive view of data visualization as a neutral and scientific method of display. Invisible. The view from nowhere is always a view from somewhere. Figure 1.2, time-based visualization of global shipping routes.
I'm going to skip this.
The website also, Source 32, Chapter 1. It inhabits an omniscient, godlike perspective, but the trick is that the bodies who help to create the visualization, whether through providing the underlying data, collecting it, processing it, or designing the image that you see, it have themselves been rendered invisible. There are no bodies in the image anymore. Haraway terms this the view from nowhere. But the view from nowhere is always a view from somewhere, the view from the default. Sometimes this view comes into focus when considering what isn't revealed, as in the case of McWhorter's search query. But when we do not remind ourselves to ask what we are not seeing, and about who we are not seeing well, that is the most serious body issue of all. It's serious because all images and interactions, the data they are based on, and the knowledge they produce comes from bodies. As a result, this knowledge is necessarily incomplete. It's also necessarily culturally, politically, and historically circumscribed. Pretending otherwise entails a belief in what sociologist Ruha Benjamin, in Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, describes as the imagined objectivity of data and technology, because it's not objectivity at all. To be clear, this does not mean that there is no value in data or technology.
And just reinforce this with another day-to-day example. The idea, for instance, in music theory, the development of music theory took as its starting point all of the sort of the Western canon when it came to the development of music. It was in a little white bubble of dead European white composers. And these dead European white guys were the pool of data when it came to like the development of music theory. There's an entire video about how music theory is racist. And I understand why when you're in a culture, you understand these things, right? But of course, they didn't just smuggle in this, or they didn't just say, well, this is only Western music. They wanted to say, this is music theory for all music. These are the best pieces in the world, in all time, in all history. And other cultures, even if they put up their best composer against our best composer, it's just not a European white guy who's dead. So obviously, it's not going to fit within this rubric of what constitutes good music. And building in these biases while also pretending to objectively assess things, say, oh, well, I'm just, looking at Beethoven, Bach, and they're great. And yeah, like Bach is my favorite composer. Beethoven's probably next, but like Bach is by a long way. Bach is absolutely my favorite composer. But that doesn't mean because he's my favorite composer and he was brilliant and really moved music forward and thought about things on like almost a geometric kind of level when it comes to his fugues in his contrapoints. It doesn't mean that he is objectively better than a great composer of music in India. He's just one of there. So objectivity is a very suspicious concept, shall we say. I'm not saying it doesn't exist or can't exist or we can't all subjectively agree on something that becomes what we hold as an objective fact, but too often people resort to claiming objectivity when a result built in bias reflects their bias.
What this means for data science is this. If we truly care about objectivity in our work, we must pay close attention to whose perspective is assumed to be the default. Almost always, this perspective is the one of elite white men, since they occupy the most privileged position in the field, as they do in our society overall. Because they occupied this position, they rarely find their dominance challenged, their neutrality called into question, or their perspectives open to debate. Their privilege renders their bodies invisible, in data sets, in algorithms, and in visualizations, as in their everyday lives. Ever heard of the phrase, history is written by the victors? It's the same sort of idea. Both in the writing of history and in our work with data, we can learn so much more, and we can get closer to some sort of truth if we bring together as many bodies and perspectives as we can. And when it comes to bringing these bodies back into data science, feminism becomes increasingly instructive, as the rest of the chapters in this book explain.
Very true.
In on rational, scientific, objective viewpoints from mythical, imaginary, impossible standpoints, we build on Haraway's notion of the God trick, exploring some reasons why emotion has been kept out of data science as a field, and what we think emotion can, in fact, contribute. We talk about emotional data, among data of many other forms, in What Gets Counted Counts, a chapter that emphasizes the importance of thinking though each and every one of the choices we make when collecting and classifying data. The next chapter, Unicorns, Janitors, Ninjas, Wizards, and Rock Stars, challenges the assumption that data scientists are lone rangers who wrangle meaning from mess. Instead, we show how working with communities and embracing multiple perspectives can lead to a more detailed picture of the problem at hand. This argument is continued in The Numbers Don't Speak for Themselves, in which we show how much of bodies invisible. The view from nowhere is always a view from somewhere. Today's work involving big data prioritizes size over context. In contrast, feminist projects connect data back to their sources, pointing out the biases and power differentials in their collection environments that may be obscuring their meaning. We turn to the contexts and communities that ensure that the work of data science can take place in Show Your Work.
I'm just going to call them out. They should have put this in the introduction. I'm sorry, like, you walk people through that's what the purpose of an introduction is. You don't bury it in the middle of your first chapter. I generally, like I said, have a lot of sympathy with the authors here, but dumping this explanation, I'm assuming, I can't really scroll up without messing things up, but if all of these are like Show Your Work and the Power chapter and Teach Data Like an Intersectional Feminist, if these are the names of the chapters in the book, this chapter, or these paragraphs should have been in the introduction. The introduction was not an introduction. The introduction was itself like a substantive chapter, and it didn't do this. So why would you do this in the middle or toward the end of chapter 1 when setting up the entire structure of the book is what the introduction is for? Not good, not good.
A chapter that centers on issues of labor. In the Power chapter, it's, power, privilege, and structural inequality that we take up and explore.
I have to slam the authors on this. This is not the place. You should be only talking about the substance of your first chapter in your first chapter. Like, you are setting things up. You don't, okay, big thumbs down on this. Big thumbs down on the organization. This is not, it's not helpful to have yourself have this really interesting discussion about lived experience and all this stuff, and then suddenly be taken into a discussion on the book structure.
Teach Data Like an Intersectional Feminist provides a series of examples of how to implement the lessons of the previous chapters in classrooms, workshops, and offices, so that we can train the next generations of data feminists. And in Now Let's Multiply, we speculate about other approaches that might enrich a conversation about data science, its uses, and its limits. There is growing discussion about the uses and limits of data science, especially when it comes to questions of ethics and values. But so far, feminist thinking hasn't directed the conversation as it might. As a starting point, let's take the language that is increasingly employed to discuss questions of ethics in data and the algorithms that they support, such as the computer vision and predictive policing algorithms we've described just above. The emerging best practices in the field of data ethics involve orienting algorithmic work around concepts like bias and values like fairness, accountability, and transparency. This is a promising development, especially as conversations about data and ethics enter the mainstream and funding mechanisms for research on the topic proliferate. But there is an additional opportunity to reframe the discussion before it gathers too much speed, so that its orienting concepts do not inadvertently perpetuate an unjust status quo. Consider this chart, which uses Benjamin's prompt to reconsider the imagined objectivity of data and technology in order to develop an alternative set of orienting concepts for the field. These concepts have legacies in intersectional feminist activism, collective organizing, and critical thought, and they are unabashedly explicit in how they work towards justice.
Hey, Scribby. Yeah, I agree. Like, usually there's a summary at the end of the chapter that kind of says, hey, well, let's go. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them. Tell them what you told them. You can't go wrong in writing if you just follow the basics. And I agree, a lot of times you'll kind of like want to wrap things up and point ahead, but they just threw that in. And now they've gone on to more substance. Like they've got this entire chart now that they are talking about the objectivity in data. We are like nowhere near the end of this chapter. So why would you put a discussion? Okay, we're not that far off the end of the chapter. But honestly, like why would you put that in the middle of your chapter? It makes no sense to me. Really makes no sense to me. And by the way, hi Smash the Patriarchy. I know you're starting from the beginning, and so welcome to the stream when you get to this part, and always good to see you. All right, so continuing on. Like I said, if I were a reviewer on this book, I would definitely have comments. I wouldn't say don't publish it, but I personally am like way too lazy when I read something to like think about this kind of stuff. Like, think about why near 3/4 of the way through chapter 1 am I learning about the structure of this book? I don't want to have to think about that because that's not where that goes. Where that goes is in the introduction, so that I get a whole roadmap of tell them what you're going to tell them. The introduction is tell them what you're going to tell them. And then you tell them, and then your concluding chapter is tell them what you told them, and then look forward. But every chapter is tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them, tell them what you told them, tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them. I know it's repetitive, but it exists for a reason, and that's because it helps orient the reader to what they're going to take on, or what they should accomplish, or what they should come across, and then to remind them why it all connects together at the end. Sorry, I have very narrow structured ideas about what constitutes clear and good writing, and it doesn't involve putting things in places where they don't make sense. So that's my little rant on how to structure an article, a chapter, a book.
Concepts which uphold imagined objectivity because they locate the source of the problem in individuals or technical systems. Intersectional feminist concepts which strengthen real objectivity because they acknowledge structural power differentials and work towards dismantling them.
So I'm going to skip this so we get concepts upon which uphold imagined objectivity, ethics, bias, fairness, accountability, and transparency. And intersectional feminist concepts which strengthen real objectivity, justice, oppression, equity, co-liberation, and reflexivity. There's a whole lot of stuff in here. Also, understanding algorithms concept comes up under imagined objectivity, and intersectional feminist, the last one is understanding history, culture, and context. I feel like they're rushing through this table, and I really wish they wouldn't because it looks really interesting. And there's probably a lot to unpack, and I feel like when I scrolled down, there wasn't that much left of the chapter.
Intersectional feminist.
I'm going to pause that. And I'm going to see if yay! All right, it's reworking again. Okay, I just had to restart it. I really wish they kind of would have spent more time on this, but they didn't, so we're gonna continue on.
The concept of bias, for example, locates the source of inequity in the behavior of individuals, that is a prejudiced person, or in the outcomes of a technical system, that is a system that favors white people or men. Under this conceptual model, a technical goal might be to create an unbiased system. First, we would design a system, use data to tune its parameters, and then we would test for any biases that result.
All right, so I'm going to tell you why this bothers me. why this table also bothers me. I was taught, and I taught my students, if you're not going to refer to everything in a table, don't put it in. The whole point of having a table or a figure or something is when it's not named. Oh, the other thing, okay, it's not numbered, it doesn't have a title, and it doesn't have a source. So I would mark down for all three of those. Also, it doesn't have, so I'm doing academic review here, right? What I would say. So you should have in this, like, depending on how many images you have figures, which are images, and you have tables. This is a table, and this table contains specific information, and the only reason you put a table in is to refer to it. And it's not just enough, I don't think, to like refer to one thing in the table, because people have to read the table. So if you're going to make people read stuff that's in your table, then refer to it. Don't just think a table stands on its own as a piece of information. So yeah, there's no point in having a table if you're not going to unpack it. Absolutely. And I'm not saying that they're doing like a terrible, like, again, this would be like not a reason to not have the book, but it would strengthen the book. One, get rid of that whole section on your book order in the middle of this chapter. Put those words in the introduction so that you can make space in your word count for this chapter. And the next one, there's some really interesting things here. You could actually take this table, concepts of which uphold imagined objectivity and feminist concepts that strengthen real objectivity, and put this at the beginning, right? And then you could refer to this table of like, here's how ethics and bias, right? And we could do the ethics with the target thing, right? We could talk about bias in terms of the facial recognition, right? Accountability. Who's accountable? So if you had put this table at the start of the chapter, you could actually refer to it multiple times in order to compare and contrast imagined objectivity and these feminist concepts that strengthen real objectivity, thereby demonstrating the usefulness of the concept of this sort of structure anyway. By sticking it in at the end, you're basically tagging it on without linking it to your prior use cases. And thereby it just becomes another thing to look at, and people are people don't read tables. They're just eyes are gonna glaze over it. So I'm not saying, it's not to say that they shouldn't have published this or that this was not a good table to put in, but you gotta label it correctly and you gotta use it correctly. All right. So you can you see what it's like when I'm doing a peer review for, and this is just on the writing, it's not on the substance, but this is why you have an outside person come in and go like, I'm reading this fresh. And like, why are you telling me this when you could have told me, way back when? This is exactly what peer review looks like.
We could even define what might be more fair, and then we could optimize for that. But this entire approach is flawed, like the imagined objectivity that shaped it. Just as Benjamin cautions against imagining that data and technology are objective, we must caution ourselves against locating the problems associated with biased data and algorithms in technical systems alone. This is a danger that computer scientists have noted in relation to high-stakes domains like criminal justice, where hundreds of years of history, politics, and economics, not to mention the complexities of contemporary culture, are distilled into black-boxed algorithms that determine the course of people's lives.
I noticed that since I refreshed it, the voice sounds more natural, so maybe there was a problem when I swapped voices before. I probably should have done that before, but I've learned it now.
In this context,
every day is a school day.
Computer scientist Ben Green warns about the narrowness of computationally conceived fairness, writing that computer scientists who support criminal justice reform ought to proceed thoughtfully, ensuring that their efforts are driven by clearer alignment with the goals of justice, rather than a zeitgeist of technological solutionism. And in keynoting the Data Justice Conference in Sasha Costanza-Chock challenged the audience to expand their concept of ethics to justice. In particular, restorative justice, which recognizes and accounts for the harms of the past. We do not all arrive in the present moment with equal power and privilege.
True.
When fairness is a value that does not acknowledge context or history, it fails to acknowledge the systematic nature of the unfairness perpetrated by certain groups on other groups for centuries. Does this make fairness political? Emphatically yes, because all systems are political.
Yep.
In fact, the appeal to avoid politics is a very familiar move for those in power to continue to uphold the status quo.
This. Yeah, you want to dismantle the current order. Like, well, current order is racist and sexist and unfair, so yeah, like, we can do better. Why are you defending a crappy system?
Ability to do so is also a privilege, one held only by those whose existence does not challenge that same status quo. Rather than designing algorithms that are colorblind, Costanza-Chock says, we should be designing algorithms that are just.
Nice.
This means shifting from ahistorical notions of fairness to a model of equity.
Yep.
This model would take time, history, and differential power into account. Researcher Sita P. Gangadaran, co-lead of the Our Data Bodies project, states,
This is why I'm quite happy to let the computer pronounce these names, because I wouldn't have gotten even close. And it just reads them off with confidence. Don't know if it always does it well, but yes, I am just like not used to non-Western names, and I feel so embarrassed when I have to do it. So thank you, computer program, for taking away my messing things up terribly.
the question is, bodies invisible. How do we make automated systems fairer, but rather to think about how we got here? How might we recover that ability to collectively self-determine? This is why bias in individuals, in data sets, or in algorithms is not a strong enough concept in which to anchor ideas about equity and justice. In writing about the creation of New York's welfare management system in the early 1970s, for example, Virginia Eubanks describes these early big data systems were built on a specific understanding of what constitutes discrimination, personal bias.
Mm-hmm.
The solution at the time was to remove the humans from the loop, and it remains so today. Without potentially bad, in this case, racist, apples, there would be less discrimination. But this line of thinking illustrates what Robin DiAngelo would call the new racism, the belief that racism is due to individual bad actors rather than structures or systems.
Yep.
In relation to welfare management, this often means replacing the women of color social workers, who have empathy and flexibility and listening skills, with an automated system that applies a set of rigid criteria, no matter what the circumstances. Bias is not a problem that can be fixed after the fact. Instead, we must look to understand and design systems that address oppression at the structural level. Oppression, as defined by the comic artist Robot Hugs, is what happens when prejudice and discrimination is supported and encouraged by the world around you. It is when you are harmed or not helped by government, community, or society at large because of your identity, they explain. And while the research and energy emerging around algorithmic accountability is promising, why should we settle for retroactive audits of potentially flawed systems if we could design for co-liberation from the start? Here, co-liberation doesn't mean free the data, but rather free the people. And the people in question are not only those with less power, but also those with relative privilege, like data scientists, designers, researchers, educators, like ourselves, who play a role in upholding oppressive systems. Poet and community organizer Tawana Petty defines what co-liberation means in relation to anti-racism in the U.S. We need whites to firmly believe that their liberation, their humanity, is also dependent upon the destruction of racism and the dismantling of white supremacy. The same goes for gender. Men are
Yeah, I was just gonna say, this is my position on patriarchy. Yeah, I think that, I've come so far in the last 10 years, a lot of it because of Black Twitter. I'm mourn the loss of my access to Black Twitter, but also just being more involved via an online community, and Kevin's show and our work, where we try to highlight these things, is also educational. And understanding like the white bubble I lived in, and the conditioning, the fragility, the white fragility that goes along with white privilege. It's harder, I think, to talk about liberation, because obviously when you're the not oppressed group, it's not always, you're not thinking about your own liberation, right? But we do need to liberate white culture from the white bubble, the white supremacist bubble that has been crafted for us by generations of post-Confederate narrative and collaborative white people who decided their racial identity was more important than their humanity when it came to justice and protecting their own self-interests. And we indoctrinate our children, like they're trying to do in Florida, into this notion that white people have never really done any harm. White men in particular always did more good than harm. Yeah, the founding fathers might have been one of them might have been a sexual predator, and they might have owned people and tortured them, kidnapped them, participated in trafficking them, had them maybe murdered on their commands. But there's no but. That's just that's a fact. And we need to stop as white people trying to offset evil with good, because you end up ruining like the good. You have to acknowledge the bad and own it. That's the only way that you can actually look at the good in a context that is honest, in my opinion. So obviously, yes, there's an element of white bubble liberation there, but the real impact of white people getting out of their white bubble is going to be the quality of life of non-white people, because we will be more invested as a group in expanding freedoms and individual liberties and opportunities and meritocracies than we are in blaming a racial group for their own poverty, for the effects of structural racism on them. It's very easy for people in privilege to blame the people oppressed for their own oppression. It takes a lot more emotional and intellectual honesty, emotional maturity to realize that you're part of a racist system, and the only way you can fix it is to destroy it. Same thing with patriarchy. The patriarchy ruins everything. There's no good that comes from it. White supremacy ruins everything. And yet, so many people cling to both.
Are often not even thought to have a gender, let alone prompted to think about how unequal gender relations seep into our institutions and artifacts and harm all of us. In these situations, it is not enough to do audits after the fact. We should be able to dream of data-driven systems that position co-liberation as their primary design goal. Designing data sets and data systems that dismantle oppression and work towards justice, equity, and co-liberation requires new tools in our collective toolbox. We have some good starting points. Building more understandable algorithms is a laudable, worthy research goal. And yet, what we need to explain and account for are not only the inner workings of machine learning, but also the history, culture, and context that lead to discriminatory outputs in the first place. Did you know, for example, that the concept of homophily, which provides the rationale for most contemporary network clustering algorithms, in fact, derives from 1950s to era? 36, Chapter 1. Bring Back the Bodies, Models of Housing Segregation. If not, we recommend you read Wendy Chun. For another example, did you know that the Lena image used to test most image processing algorithms is the centerfold from the November 1972 issue of Playboy, cropped demurely at the shoulders?
There is a great video I've actually watched and thought about covering on this show, and it is precisely about this issue of Lena and how it was held over. One could perhaps plausibly make the argument that when it was taken in the early 1970s and used, that it had some algorithmic training merit to it. However, the image stayed on long past its usefulness as the technology moved on because of the male gaze, not because it was a good picture. Guys just liked looking at a hot woman smiling at them, and so they're like, "Oh, we need to test this image. I'm going to put it, I'm going to test it and put it in my published article, and then we'll put Lena in there." It was totally a male gaze issue, and yeah, just kind of reflects how those biases are covered up by, oh, well, it has to like look at her hair and has to look at this sort of skin tone over here, when in fact the kind of technologies that had been achieved by that point, that those kind of issues weren't modern anymore. They'd already fixed them. They just kept her because she was hot.
If not, Jacob Gabrey is the one to consult on the subject. These are not merely bits of trivia to be pulled out to impress dinner party guests. On the contrary, they have very real implications for the design of algorithms and for their use. How might we design a network clustering algorithm that does not perpetuate segregation, but actively strives to bring communities together? This is a question that Chun is pursuing in her current research. How might we ensure that the selection of test data isn't ever relegated to happenstance? This is how the Lena image, which encoded sexism into the field of image processing, is explained away. The first step requires transparency in our methods, as well as the reflexivity to understand how our own identities, our communities, and our domains of expertise are part of the problem. But they can also be part of the solution. When we start to ask questions like, whose bodies are benefiting from data science? Whose bodies are harmed? How can we use data science to design for a more just and equitable future? And by whose values will we remake the world? We are drawing from data feminism. It's data feminism that we describe in the rest of this book. It's what can help us understand how power and privilege operate in the present moment and how they might be rebalanced in the future. Chapter 2.
Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1. I hope you all enjoyed it. I did find the name of the video that I was thinking about, and maybe I can do this as a special one-off, how patriarchy ruins everything, or maybe Kevin and I can cover it. Image You can't submit to journals anymore. Yeah, journals finally said, look, this is like creepy. Y'all need to like stop using this in a computer algorithmic processing or submit. And that should be enough. And YouTube. We'll also narrow it down to that. Yeah. Okay, the image, you can't submit to journals anymore. The most widely used image in academic history is no longer accepted in journals. So what happened? It's an excellent video. It's really, really good.
So a little while back, I was submitting my first ever paper to a...
Yeah, if people are interested in that, I will put that link in the chat right now, so that if you... What was it called again? I can't even remember. The image you can't submit. Okay. Submit. Yeah. All right, so we got through chapter 1. I still have to get through chapter 3. I'm so behind on this book. So I might be back in the future, not too long, to continue on with chapter 2, because in all honesty, this is a great way for me to do my necessary reading for my Data Feminism book club. It gives me a motivation to do it, and it shares it with you, which is fantastic.
technical journal.
So yeah, I'm going to wrap it up there. I have curry waiting for me. It's been marinating now, cooling off, getting all ready to be eaten, and I am excited because I'm hungry. I don't know if you heard my stomach. Probably not because I muted it, but I'm going to get going. Thank you all for joining me. I may or may not be back tomorrow. We'll see how motivated I am. I might do a surprise stream and try to get through chapter 2. Because once I'm through chapter 3, I'm caught up with where the group is, and I'd really like to do that. So maybe I'll use this time on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, to get caught up so that I can get that out of the way for work. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. If you're watching this in the future, you're going to see the next chapter, whether it's tomorrow or not. So thank you to the people who stopped by, bigzebra.com, Scribby, I see in the chat, Professor Wright. Is that, if I'm saying it correctly? Oh, where's my Speechify when I need it? Thank you for stopping by. And of course, smashing the patriarchy. Anyone else who stopped by but did not comment, thank you also for your time and attention. And so then, until next time, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. And have a wonderful day before New Year's Eve, wherever it is and whenever it is you are. Okay, yeah, I'll just do the stop the stream from the page so we can all see this. All right, fantastic. All right. I'll catch you all in the next one, and have a good one. Bye.